Good evening. I'm Rich Park. Welcome to my study. It's September 17th, and this is the session on a brief history of pedagogy in the 20th century. I'm going to cover the items out of Julie Coates' book, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of the things I've put together. I'm going to do some things a little bit differently. One, I'm not going to be online tonight. I'm unable to be here physically, so I prepared a presentation for you that I hope you will enjoy. I've tried to put together some of the things that I've seen in my life over the 20th century, and some of the things that will reflect what's in the book, but also some of the perceptions that have been established around education, and things that you might find interesting, entertaining, and also reflective of the times in which they were generated. So I think it'll be fun, so enjoy the session, and I hope to have a copy of this online for you. Thank you. Goodbye.
School days, dear old golden rule days, reading and writing and arithmetic, taught to the tune of a hickory stick. You were my queen in calico, I was your bashful barefoot beau, and you wrote on my slate, I love you, Joe, when we were a couple of kids.
The 20th century began with the United States moving from the agriculture to the factory and the labor demanded by those factories, and that changed the way schools worked. People had to be educated. There were things happening that required higher skill rates. Schooling was no longer optional actually after the 1800s, and schools became more tasked to educating workers for the factories. It was necessary to bring people into the urban areas from the rural areas, and traditionally the rural areas may not have emphasized the reading and writing skills, as we'll see or hear later when I read a bit about Jesse Stewart and the thread that runs so true and some of the things he was having to transition in back in the 1920s. Also, we had an influx of immigrant populations, and that was changing the demographics of the country. Different classes of workers, different skills, languages, how to function in our society, and how to be a part of the population and melt in with the rest of it. In 1900, only about 6% of students had completed 5 years of schooling, according to the author, Ms. Coates, in her book. But by 2000, 88% of students graduated high school. The progressive education movement was driven largely by the new socioeconomic conditions in the nation. Different classes of people were moving in. The economy was changing to an industrial age from a agricultural age. And schools, according to the progressive movement, emphasized behavior as important as demonstrating knowledge. Standards for punishment and reward were considered a standard procedure, and progressive educators like Dewey, Wirt, and others, we had the Dewey Plan, the Gary Plan, and the Dalton Plan, which I'll discuss in a moment. Dewey was probably one of the most progressive players, and he probably did more to establish the progressive education movement than any of the others. He was one of the most well-known thinkers, and he went well beyond just dealing with the core subjects taught to students. His interest was to balance that and blend that with the education needed to support in the industrial arena, agriculture, and just social education. All of these things had to work together because they were all important to society. The progressive education movement really emphasized the learner as their goal and philosophy, to learn by experience rather than by rote. Also, Dewey was very much a proponent of the idea where it was up to the schools to bring the immigrant populations in and socialize them into the melting pot. Dewey is not considered a generational learning style person, but his philosophy and concepts certainly went along with that. And of course, this was early on in the century, the 20th century. The Gary Plan was probably the best known educational reform plan. Gary, of course, or the Gary Plan was one of the progressive educational movement components, and it essentially adopted Dewey's philosophy. It was founded by William Wirt, who was a school superintendent in Gary, Indiana, and thus the Gary Plan name. Also of note here, Gary, Indiana, Hammond, Indiana, and South Chicago are all South Lake Michigan cities, and of course they're on the lake there, so there is transportation for goods, services, and materials throughout the Great Lakes area and beyond. And that's a heavy industrial area, so it really made sense to have a progressive plan there that was creating an industrial workforce, because that was such an area for various economies to develop. The Gary Plan also went into the notion of the woman's domestic role in the household, and it's described in the text as being one that in order to stabilize the worker and stabilize labor concerns, union concerns, the housewife, or the homemaker, if they called her that in those days, that individual, dealt with the home economics functions. In other words, balancing the budget, keeping stability at home, encourage workers to go to work, come home, be happy, and this role also defined very structured roles in society. The plan for education was adopted according to the text by hundreds of schools nationally. Late in the second decade, there was a Dalton Plan that was established that was also considered one of the progressive movements. All that's said about it, it sliced education into contract units and seemed to add more structure to the education process. And my take on it was, as they described this, it mentioned schools are becoming more like factories. Well, the Dalton Plan seemed to emphasize that more strictly. And even William Wirt, rather than issuing diplomas, even though he was a proponent of the Dewey philosophy, he is said to have issued work certificates rather than diplomas, just something there that was more of a phrasing than anything else. But by the second decade of the 20th century, education seemed to be taking its lead from what it was providing to the industry, or what the industry and factories were demanding standardized conveyor belt curricula, emphasizing the reward and punishment system. And interestingly enough, for a progressive movement that started out as a system to lead the learner, or let the learner direct themselves in their learning process and learn by experience and have that rich learning environment, it tended to be lost to the institution to meet the demands of the factories. As a matter of fact, compulsory education was essentially law in all states, and the idea of meeting the factory's needs, adapting behavior to the factory, education serving the manufacturing process, that behavior, that schedule, tended to be well established in the 1930s, and largely that has been the founding environment for education until as we know it today. And of course, as we move into the 21st century, those things are changing, but that's going to be in another chapter.